You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. So friends, this is my fourth opportunity to introduce Murray Cornelius to you. He oversees the missions work of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, which is allied with the Assemblies of God in the United States and in other parts of the world, in their missions programming. He's a missionary's kid himself, has had a huge impact around the world. I've been interviewing for him the last 3 programs, and this is the last one. You won't want to miss it. He's a fascinating character. And then I'll continue with our Bible study. Should be a good half hour.
JCT TV is the official voice of WOW, working for orphans and widows. Jim Cantelon is the founder of WOW and has been ministering to orphans and widows in distress for 18 years. WOW's focus is home-based care for the dying. The horizon is vast, with thousands of the least of these in Africa and India. WOW depends on your generous support. To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
Murray Cornelius, Executive Director of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada Missions Program, involved in 75 countries. We've been having some tremendous conversations. I want to ask you about missions in general in the 21st century as it relates to both evangelism and social justice. When I was growing up as a preacher's kid, most missionaries did not talk about social justice. They talked about evangelism, which I fully appreciate and understand. It's very important. But the social justice component has really emerged in the last, couple decades? Or maybe more?
Well, I think maybe more. While they may not have talked about social justice, I think that the history of the mission of the church around the world is that it's always been engaged in social justice. It may not have used that language, but I think intuitively, responsively, they were living in places of poverty, they were living in places of injustice, and the church always engaged with those things. And I think of my own parents. My dad was involved in education. My mom was involved in, and she wasn't a nurse, but she did nursing. She did what she could. We were always engaged in the social issues that people face.
Yeah, I guess what's happened in the last few decades is that it's on the table now, and it's identified as a significant component in overall missions work. I fully hear what you're saying. When you're immersed in an impoverished culture, you have to feed the sick. You have to heal. I should say, feed the hungry and heal the sick. You have to do this. How is social justice factoring into your overall strategy these days?
Yeah, we sort of have two foci that we clearly identify. That one is that we will relentlessly seek to bring the gospel to those with little or no access, to try to get to those places where people have never had an opportunity to hear about Jesus. That has to be at the forefront of what we do. At the same time, we want to bring sustainable solutions to the issues of poverty, injustice wherever we find ourselves. People are facing all kinds of humanitarian issues. And so we say, how can we bring sustainable developmental solutions to the problems that they have?
And are most of these related to food and food security and health issues, or does it go beyond that?
It goes beyond that. We would have people that are engaged with issues of human trafficking. Certainly education is a big part of what we engage in. Issues with refugees and migration and all that. You've got, people don't realize this, in Uganda you have over 1 million South Sudanese refugees. We're involved with those refugees. In Bangladesh, you've got nearly 1 million Rohingya people that have come in. We're involved with those refugees. So all of that plays in.
When you talk about these involvements with millions of refugees, it's overwhelming, is it not? I mean, where do you start?
Well, you can't look at the numbers and say we have to solve this problem. You say, Lord, what can we do? What's our piece of the puzzle? What's our piece of the need here? And you try and lean in with the resources, the partnerships that we have. This is not often stuff that's done on the forefront by our Canadian personnel. It's done through our Canadian personnel, but our partnerships that we have on the ground in Uganda, in Bangladesh, in India, we have partnerships with local indigenous people who are very much engaged in the issues.
The Rohingya issue, is that going to be resolved, or are these people going to be displaced people for the rest of their lives?
I can't see a quick solution to this. I don't see a quick repatriation to Myanmar of these people, nor do I see them just assimilating into Bangladeshi life and culture. I think they may find themselves as refugees for a significant period of time.
And the land that they're currently occupying with their refugee camps, it's the worst of possible land, is it not? It's not subject to flooding and other kinds of issues?
Well, the whole country of Bangladesh is subject to flooding.
Isn't that true? And with the rise of sea levels, Bangladesh could be in big trouble.
It's a delta, and so you constantly, so when the rains come in, it's just, flooding is a serious problem. It's not any more marginal land than anywhere else. It's just there are so many people on such a small piece of land that they can't grow their own crops. They can't sustain themselves. Whereas if you come to northern Uganda with South Sudanese, they've all got a little bit of land. They can grow their own crops. They can fend for themselves. The situation in Bangladesh is much worse.
How's it going with your international workers? A businessman will tell you his biggest challenge is always his staff. I don't know if that's the case in ministry or not. But with 75 countries and how many hundreds of people now involved?
We have about 330.
330. Is a lot of your time and energy spent in personnel issues?
Well, I got a great staff, and I have some regional people who look after that. It's not that I don't engage in that. I try and keep myself a little bit more focused on our vision, our strategy, where we're going. But whenever you're working with people, whether they are our Canadian personnel or whether they're our partners, people are people, and we have some challenges from time to time to help encourage people. Sometimes, they face their own challenges. They face health challenges, safety challenges, partnership challenges, differences in culture, clashing. There's all kinds of things that can make our kind of work more difficult.
When your mom and dad were involved in missions in Africa, my mom and dad were involved basically in below the poverty line pastoring of small churches. There was a high idealistic component. The sense was, the Lord has called us to do this, and we'll do it regardless of the cost. You'd never heard of any missionary or pastor, for that matter, saying, how much am I going to earn? Am I going to have benefits? Are my kids going to be sent to a private school? These days, there seems to me there's more of a sense of entitlement, is there not?
Well, I think I'd come to the defense of my workers and say many of them are highly called, willing to make significant sacrifices, place themselves in places of significant danger, take their families and raise their children in those contexts. I do think, however, we do live in a different day and age, and we don't have to expect these people to live impoverished lives as they do what they do. One of my jobs is to ensure that we are providing them with some safety nets when they retire, and some good education for their children, and a decent living wage that they can live on. I think today's church needs to do what it can, and it can do better than the previous simply because it has more resources.
Is it easier or more difficult, or is it about the same over the last 20, 30 years to sell missions vision to churches? Or are churches less amenable to someone coming in from the outside presenting the needs of the world?
I think one of the challenges you have is in the past, people came to church much more often than they do now, and so there were many more times during the week when there was an opportunity to share in a church context. Now we have to do it in other ways. We do it through the internet and through social media and various other ways we tell our stories. But I still think that if people are true followers of Christ, they have an outbound attitude. They have a concern for those who've not heard the gospel. They have a concern for the marginalized and the vulnerable. That outbound nature of the follower of Jesus Christ, I think, is still alive today. People still think that.
Yeah, and I think it's part and parcel of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit.
It is.
mean, when the Lord is indwelling, you have a sense of responsibility for your neighbor. We got about 3 minutes, Murray. I want to shift gears here. You're working on a doctoral program right now in Springfield, Missouri. Mm-hmm. What are you studying?
In my last few years in Zimbabwe, before I came back into this role, I'd started another church, sort of on the side. I had a bigger responsibility, but I started this church. But what really frustrated me was these young men and women, very well educated, with little economic opportunity. And I started to ask the question, what's the role of the church in providing some economic empowerment to these people? Everybody knows the old phrase, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That is incomplete, actually. Because you can teach a man to fish and give him all the equipment, but if he has no access to the lake, you're just frustrating him. Many young people have no access to the economic world. So how does the church help them to get started? And so I'm looking at models of what people are doing that can help to bring some economic empowerment. Not just trusting that the gospel will do that, but how can the church be proactive in bringing economic empowerment to particularly young men, young women. And I'm not talking about micro enterprise so much as the next level up from that.
Really?
Yeah.
And there are models out there that you can study?
There are models out there.
It's going to take you a lot of time and a lot of travel to get to them all, right?
Like all PhD dissertations, you've got to really focus it. So I'll be focusing exclusively on some relationships that I have in Zimbabwe, and focusing on what the Zimbabwean church is doing in the midst of its absolute economic crisis. There are people who are addressing that issue.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Why not go with what you know, right?
Yeah.
And do the research.
Yeah, you study it. I study it wider than that, and I read what's happening around the world. But the research will be focused.
What do you want to do with this? Once you got your doctorate, what do you want to do with it?
Well, you're a good model of somebody who's supposed to have retired by now, but hasn't retired. Right. I don't plan to retire. I may not keep doing what I'm doing, but I would like to spend a number of years of my life in teaching and teaching biblical perspectives on social justice and being involved with some of these models in different parts of Africa to see what I can do.
You want to live in Africa again?
We might go back, yes, very, very likely. We could do that when the time is right.
Well, why not? Why not?
Sure.
I figure as long as you can breathe, just keep pursuing a far horizon. I mean, it seems to me retirement is just not in the cards for me, at least. I don't think it is for you either.
It's a small world, and we move about quite easily, so I can keep up my third culture nature and be in both Canada and Zimbabwe as the Lord calls.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Gee, I'm there, man. You're preaching the choir here.
Yeah.
I know I'm old. I just think I'm 45. So, I'll live delusionally for the next 10 years. Murray Cornelius, my guest. It's been a terrific month with you, Murray.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Jim.
And I'll be back right after this break.
Jim Cantelon Today is a program dedicated to the teaching of the good news of Jesus Christ. This all through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. JCT also brings to you encouraging testimonies and stories from Christian leaders all over the globe. If this program has added value to your life, would you please consider becoming a partner? To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
So, we're in Mark chapter 4, and we're going to pick it up in verse 35. On the same day when evening had come, he said to them, that is to his disciples, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now, the other side of, it's called the Sea of Galilee, but, you know, I have mentioned it many times to you in the past. It's no sea, friends. It's a small lake. It's about, well, over there they use kilometers. It's about 12 kilometers long and about 6 kilometers wide, which is what's that? Maybe 6 kilometers. It's about 5 to 6 miles long and maybe 1.5 miles to 2 miles wide. It's very, very small. I don't think I got my metrics right there, but that's basically the point. It's a small lake. However, it's subject to huge storms. It's about 400 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded on the east by the Golan Heights and on the west by the Horns of Hittim, as it's called, where a famous Crusader battle occurred a few centuries ago, and the city of Tiberias. But the land is 400 feet above the level of the lake. And the winds are constant, and they come sweeping in over the land, and then they sweep down into this tropical depression where the lake is, and they stir up the water, then they sweep up to the other side. Sometimes they come from the other direction. Sometimes it seems they're coming from both directions at the same time. I've been there many times during very tumultuous weather. And Galilee is famous for major, sudden, drastic storms. Like, it can be downright scary, and especially for such a small body of water, to be so, embroiled in waves and froth and wind, and it's a tempest. That's very common there. Anyway, he says, "Let's cross over to the other side," and they would go over in one of the disciples' fishing boats. When they had left the multitude, and by the way, Jesus would spend time in the boat teaching because the crowd was so huge there in the Capernaum area that they were basically pushing him into the water anyway. So he'd go out into a boat, maybe 15, 20 feet off the shore, and he would speak to the crowds from the boat. It was kind of a natural amphitheater, and worked very well. So when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him, so there was a kind of a flotilla. I mean, Jesus had a really hard time ever being alone. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. They awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This is amazing. The disciples were struck with wonder and fear, and so would you and I be if we were in their situation. But it's interesting, throughout the course of Jesus' life and ministry, we see him rebuking evil spirits. We saw that back in Mark chapter 1. We'll see it again in Mark chapter 9. He rebukes a fever. Eventually we'll get to Luke chapter 4, and we'll see him doing that. In this case, he rebukes the wind. And not the first time in Mark chapter 8, other times we see him rebuking his disciples. His disciples earned their rebukes, believe me. So what is a rebuke? Well, you've rebuked people and you've been rebuked. It's a strong injunction in the face of strong adversity, In Jesus' case, he's rebuking the adversity of evil, the adversity of illness, the adversity of natural forces, the adversity of presumption on the part of the disciples in this case. And great calm follows a strong rebuke. Not always, because sometimes we push back when we're rebuked with a rebuke of our own. But if it's been a legitimate rebuke, it has struck home, often it kind of is like releasing through a pressure valve. Something has been pent up for a long time, and it all just kind of comes out and it's gone. That's hopefully the desired result of a strong rebuke. But I think it's interesting to know that Jesus was not loath to raise his voice. He did it on many occasions. Some would say he was an alpha male in that sense. Yes, he was. He was the leader, and sometimes he would raise his voice and he would make it very clear what he was thinking, what he was feeling, and sometimes it was his own disciples who bore the brunt of it. But sometimes, friends, if it's not someone else rebuking us, we need to be rebuking ourselves. I'm not talking here about self-hatred. I'm not talking here about, false guilt. I'm just talking about sometimes we have to take ourselves in hand. Sometimes a dear friend, a loving spouse, one of our children might help us in this area by confronting us in some kind of intervention with our behavior or something needs to be corrected. But a rebuke can be a good thing. In this case, Jesus rebuked the wind and the storm, and to the disciples' consternation, the wind stopped and the waves went away. It's kind of a beautiful story. I'm glad it's still there. Anyway, I won't make any more application than that. So, they go on. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes, or the Gerasenes. There's different ways of reading this in the original language. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs. No one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains, in the tombs, crying out, cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. He cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." He asked him, "What's your name?" He answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Okay, there's more to the story here, but let me just take it that far. He is known as the Gadarene or the Gerasene demoniac. He was obviously demon-possessed. He was out of his mind. He was endued with a supernatural power through his evil spirit possession. He was a fright to everyone, and he probably was a fright to himself, but he lived in the tombs. This would be in the area outside of the closest urban area. The tombs were the area where leopards would live, and there's no mention here of leopards, but it's quite likely there were leopards there too. But what's interesting is that this demon-possessed man, Legion, which means there were many evil spirits residing within him, recognizes Jesus right away and rushes up to him and worships him. What that means is he fell down on his face in front of Jesus. He wasn't there to love Jesus, but he was there to acknowledge Jesus' power over him. And he recognized in Jesus the authority to destroy the demons. The demons don't want to be destroyed. And so they're the ones essentially who are calling out loudly to be spared. Okay? Let me just read this. He cried out with a loud voice, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." I mean, here are tormenting spirits who are pleading with Jesus not to torment them. Obviously, they know who he is. He is the Son of God, and they recognize his power. They recognize that he can, just by a word, send them back to their master. Right now, they have relative freedom in that they're dwelling, if you will, on the earth and indwelling poor, vulnerable people. Much better that for them than to be in hell itself, where they themselves are tormented by Satan. Jesus has authority over them. Friends, Jesus has authority over evil. And I'm not just talking here about demonic spirits. I'm talking about any evil in your life. This is why there's genius in coming to the Lord with your burdens and with your need and say, Father, please help me. Jesus, save me. I need you every hour. I need you. What we know from the scripture and from personal experience is when we come to him with that kind of a plea, he always answers in the affirmative.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
Remember, friends, when you support JCT and or WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, we're part and parcel of the same ministry, to ask for your copy of Cantelon's Casual Commentary. You have to ask for it. We can't assume that you want it unless you ask for it, okay? Because some of you already have it. Some of you have all 4 tranches of Matthew. This is the first volume of Mark. The second one's coming really soon. It's a commentary that apparently people are really enjoying. I hope so. I spent a lot of time writing it. I'm way ahead of you. I'm halfway through, actually 2/3 of the way through the book of Acts right now in my writing. I've done Luke already. The second half of Mark's coming to you soon. And then we'll get into Luke and Acts. Luke and Acts are volume 1 and volume 2 of the same work by Luke. And then we'll do the Gospel of John, God willing. I really appreciate your support. I really do. It makes all the difference. Don't forget us. See you again next time.